The year was long past the age of Earth's innocence. Humanity had crawled outward into the cold black lungs of the galaxy, chasing profit through the frost-bitten silence between stars. Weyland-Yutani, the great corporate god of that dying age, had learned to worship two things above all others, and the money that followed it. On the outer rim of colonial space, beyond the last mapped whisper of civilization, a deep space research vessel named the Cassandra drifted through a stretch of void that the star charts refused to name. Its engines hummed low, almost reverent, as if the ship itself sensed something it did not wish to disturb. The signal came without warning. Rhythmic, impossibly old. Its frequency predated every known language, every recorded transmission, every scrap of intelligent communication humanity had ever catalogued. Yet buried within its ancient tone were fragments of something no scientist could explain. Combat-telemetry, weapon discharge patterns, energy signatures that flickered like dying suns. The Cassandra's officers stared at their monitors in disbelief. Some laughed nervously, others fell silent. And in the corporate boardrooms far away, executives leaned closer to their glowing screens, already imagining the fortunes such a discovery might birth. They believed the signal belonged to the engineers, those pale titans whose forgotten technology had haunted human myth for centuries. If even a scrap of their science could be reclaimed, entire industries would kneel before Weyland-Yutani. And so, without hesitation, without prayer, the expedition was launched. The moon they found had no name. It orbited a dead star that gave no warmth, only a bruised violet light that painted the world in the color of old wounds. Its surface was carved with structures that did not match engineer architecture. The lines were sharper, the angles more brutal, the stone older than geology should allow. Something in the shape of the place felt wrong, as though it had been built not to be seen, but to be forgotten. At the heart of the moon, buried beneath layers of black rock and frozen silence, the expedition uncovered a chamber. Cathedral vast. Its walls rose so high that helmet lamps could not find the ceiling. And at its center, resting upon a raised dais of obsidian and bone-colored metal, lay a sarcophagus. Sealed, wrapped in chains that did not rust. The air around it was colder than the vacuum outside, as if the stone itself were holding its breath. Every surface of that chamber bore the same warning, carved in 100 dialects, scratched by 1,000 desperate hands, painted in something that had once been blood. The words were different in every language, but the meaning was always the same. Do not open, do not wake, do not disturb what sleeps here. The scientists photographed the inscriptions with trembling fingers. The soldiers muttered prayers they no longer remembered how to finish. And still, the order came down from orbit. Break the seal. Greed always wins in stories like this. Greed and the arrogance that mistakes ignorance for courage. The chains were cut. The stone lid was pried loose. And for one long, breathless moment, nothing happened. The chamber remained still. The dust settled. The scientists laughed with relief. And then from inside the sarcophagus, something moved. Not violently, not desperately, simply, deliberately. The way a mountain shifts when it has decided to stand. He rose without sound. Armor the color of old war and forgotten faith. A helm without expression. Eyes that no camera could quite capture because the light behind them did not belong to this universe. He did not stagger. He did not gasp for air. He did not question where he was. He simply stood, silent as prophecy, and looked at the small, trembling figures gathered around him. The scientists. He did not answer. The soldiers raised their weapons. He did not react. For a heartbeat, the world held still, caught between one age and another, between the quiet dream of what humanity thought it was and the terrible truth of what had just been unearthed. And then the darkness moved. From the shadows of the chamber, from the cracks in the ancient walls, from tunnels that no map had ever charted, they came. Long-limbed, glistening, their skulls curved like blades, their tails whispered against stone. Xenomorph drones, dozens of them, drawn by heat and heartbeat and the intoxicating scent of unarmored flesh. They had been sleeping in the walls of this moon for longer than any human legend. And now they hunted. The screaming began quickly. It did not last long. Blood painted the sacred inscriptions in a fresh coat. Bodies fell in pieces the corporation would never be able to identify. And through the massacre, the armored figure did not flinch. He watched. He measured. He stepped forward once, into the storm of teeth and claws and dying voices. Somewhere in the darkness, an ancient warning had just come true. Something had been unleashed that neither the hive nor humanity was ever meant to face. And the silence that followed his first step would echo across galaxies. The news reached Weyland-Yutani in fragments. Static bursts, broken audio. A single helmet camera feed that ended in a scream so short it barely registered as human. Executives gathered in dim rooms lit by the pale glow of monitors, watching the same seconds of footage over and over. The armored figure stepping forward, the xenomorphs pouring in, the camera falling, and then silence, the kind of silence that money cannot buy back. At first, the corporation reacted the way corporations always do. With denial, with spreadsheets, with euphemisms. The expedition had suffered an incident. The asset remained intact. The situation was recoverable. Somewhere in a glass tower above a poisoned earth, an old man in a tailored suit tapped a finger against a polished desk and asked the only question that mattered to him. Could it be captured? Could it be sold? Could it be owned? His advisors nodded because nodding was safer than truth. And so the machinery of profit began to turn once again, blind to the thing it had just insulted. On the moon, the armored figure walked. He did not rest. He did not sleep. He did not seem to need either. He moved through the ancient chamber with the patience of a man who had already seen every kind of hell that could be built. The corpses of the expedition lay where they had fallen. He stepped over them without ceremony, without cruelty. To him, they were neither friends nor enemies. They were simply the aftermath of a mistake that had been made long before he was ever sealed away. The xenomorphs did not attack him again. Not yet. Something in their collective mind had recoiled from the first encounter. The drones that had swarmed him were gone, reduced to smears of black ichor across the stone. Whatever signal the hive used to share its hunger, it had received a new message. A warning. The kind of warning that predators learn from only once. And so for a time the moon watched him in silence, its tunnels holding their breath. He moved deeper into the ruins, past the sarcophagus, past the chamber, down corridors that had not felt footsteps in eons. The architecture changed as he descended. The brutal angles gave way to something older still. Curved walls, flowing script, murals carved with a craftsmanship that felt almost tender, as if the hands that made them had loved what they depicted, even as they feared it. This was engineer work. The Pale Titans, the forgotten gods of human myth. He studied the murals with an intensity that no scholar could match. His helm tilted, not in confusion but in recognition. The images told a story. In the first panels, the engineers stood tall against a black tide of insectile shapes. Long-limbed, bladed, xenomorphs, or something so close to them that the difference no longer mattered. The engineers had fought them, bled against them, sealed them away in vaults across the stars. So far, the story was one humanity had almost guessed at. But then the murals continued, and the story became something no human had ever imagined. Because the engineers had not only fought the black tide, they had fought something else, something that walked on cloven feet, something with horns and burning eyes and skin like cracked stone, towering figures wreathed in fire, wielding weapons that bled shadow. Demons, not metaphors, not myths. Demons carved into the walls of an alien temple older than human history. The Slayer stood before those images for a long, motionless moment. And though his face could not be seen, something in the stillness of his shoulders suggested a truth heavier than rage. Recognition. He had fought those things before. In another life. In another universe. And here they were again, painted on the walls of a world that should never have known them. He walked further. The murals continued. They showed the engineers experimenting, bleeding their own kind into black liquid, pouring that liquid into vessels, creating creatures. The xenomorph life cycle unfolded in stone, panel by panel, but it was not the beginning of the story. It was a chapter written in response to something worse. The Black Goo was not the engineer's gift to the universe. It was their weapon, their desperate attempt to build something monstrous enough to hold back a monstrous tide. The final murals were the hardest to read. They showed the engineers falling, their cities burning, their gods failing. And at the edge of the last panel, half worn away by time, a single figure stood alone against the darkness. its face hidden, its weapon raised. The Slayer looked upon that carving for a long time. Whether the figure was meant to be him, or something like him, or simply a hope the engineers had died believing in, he did not say. He never said anything. But when he turned from the wall, his stride was different. Certain. He understood now what humanity did not. This universe was not free from hell. It had merely forgotten that hell existed. The xenomorphs were not the true horror. They were the leash the engineers had built, and that leash was fraying. Somewhere beneath this moon, something older than teeth and acid was stirring. And when it woke, the difference between a Colonial Marine and a corporate executive would mean nothing at all. Far above, in orbit, Weyland-Yutani was already drafting containment protocols, already assigning designations, already imagining the armored figure as a product line. They called him the asset. They called him a specimen. They called him a resource to be recovered. They did not know what he had just seen. They did not know what he had just remembered. They did not know that in the deep silence of the ruins, he had made a decision that would reshape their empire. He would walk their moon. He would burn their hive. He would tear through their laboratories. And when the ancient thing beneath the stone finally clawed its way free, he would be waiting for it, as he had waited for every other horror that had ever crawled out of the dark. Not because he was a hero, not because he was a savior, but because that was what he was, what he had always been, what he would always be. A weapon without a master, a promise the darkness had never learned to keep. Deep beneath the moon's cracked surface, the hive breathed. It was not a sound the human ear could register, but it existed all the same. A low pulse, a wet rhythm. Thousands of chitinous bodies moving in unison, guided by a will that had no name and needed none. The queen sat at its center, vast and still, her long fingers folded beneath her second jaw, her great crown of bone tilted as she listened to the song of her children. It was a song she had heard for uncounted years on uncounted worlds. A song of hunger, a song of victory. She had never known it to falter. Until now, the Slayer descended into her kingdom without invitation. He did not sneak. He did not crawl. He walked, boots ringing against stone that had never known such an insolent sound. The tunnels of the hive were narrow and slick, coated in the resinous secretions that turned every surface into a womb of horror. Eggs pulsed in the walls. Facehuggers twitched inside their shells, sensing warmth, sensing prey. The Slayer passed them without pause. His shotgun spoke once, twice, a dozen times, and the eggs burst like rotten fruit. The facehuggers that leapt were shredded mid-air, their bodies falling in wet, useless heaps. He did not stop to admire the work. He simply moved on. In the deeper chambers, the drones began to notice. They came in twos, then fives, then dozens. They came from the ceilings, from the floors, from the hidden vents that only the hive knew existed. They came with the confidence of predators who had never been denied. And one by one they died, not in dramatic single combats, not in slow cinematic duels. They died the way pests die when a man walks into a room with a torch. Quickly, efficiently, without ceremony. The queen felt each death as a small, sharp absence in the chorus of her hive. At first she dismissed it. Losses were natural. Drones were replaceable. The hive was vast, but the absences kept coming. Tunnels she had known to be full grew quiet. Sentinels she had placed at the choke points vanished mid-signal. Even the Praetorians, her elite guard, her armored heirs, began to fall. She sent them out in packs, and the packs did not return. She sent them in waves, and the waves broke against something she could not see. She sent them in numbers that had crushed entire colonies, and still the silence grew. For the first time in her long, terrible existence, the queen felt something new, something she had never felt before, something her species was not built to understand. It began as a tremor at the base of her spine, a tightness in the great muscles of her neck, a hesitation brief and involuntary when she reached out with her mind to command her children. She did not have a word for it. Her kind had never needed one. But if she had known the human tongue, she might have called it by its proper name. The hive learned it slowly, then all at once. Drones that had never questioned an order began to hesitate at intersections. Warriors that had rushed into every battle now lingered at the edges of firelight, watching the shadows with the caution of creatures that had finally understood mortality. The song of the hive changed. Its rhythm faltered. Its confidence cracked. Somewhere in the dark, a single organism was rewriting the oldest rule the xenomorphs had ever known. The rule that said they were the apex. The rule that said nothing could stand against their numbers. The rule that said fear was something other creatures felt. And through it all, the Slayer walked. He was not alone, though he did not know it yet. In the ruined corridors of a collapsed mining outpost, a small group of human survivors had gathered around a dying lamp. There were 7 of them. A corporate engineer with a broken arm. 2 Colonial Marines whose uniforms had lost their meaning. A geologist who had stopped taking notes. A young woman who had once been a nurse. A boy of perhaps 14. And an older man who no longer remembered what he had come to this moon to do. They had been running for days. They had watched their friends die. They had learned to whisper. They had learned to weep without sound. Then the tremors began. Distant at first. Rhythmic, almost like footsteps. The Marines checked their weapons with hands that had forgotten how to stop shaking. The nurse pulled the boy closer. The engineer stared at the wall as if he could see through it, as if he could see the thing that was making the ground quake in a way he could not name. And in the far distance they heard it, the unmistakable roar of a shotgun. Then another. Then the shriek of a xenomorph cut short. Then silence. The boy asked what it was. No one answered, because no one knew. Over the next days they followed the trail, not because they were brave, because they had nowhere else to go. And what they found astonished them. The bodies of xenomorphs, whole hunting packs reduced to steaming piles of black ruin, Praetorians split in half, nests burned to their roots. And nowhere, in any of the wreckage, did they find the body of a human. Not one, not a single survivor of the expedition, not a single lost engineer, not a single unlucky miner. The thing that was hunting the hive was not hunting them. The nurse was the first to say it aloud. He does not kill people. He kills monsters. The Marines laughed at first. Nervous laughter, the kind that dies in the throat. But as the days passed and the pattern held, the laughter faded and something else took its place. Something the survivors had not felt in a very long time. Something the corporation had trained out of them. Something the hive was learning to fear. Hope. They did not know his name. They did not know his face. They only knew the sound of his weapons in the distance and the strange, quiet safety that seemed to follow him. And when the boy asked the old man who he thought the armored figure might be, the old man was silent for a long moment. Then he said in a voice that had not held certainty in years, "He is the answer to a prayer none of us remembered making." In the mirrored towers of the corporation, far from the blood and shadow of the moon, the board convened. There were 12 of them, seated around a table of black glass that reflected their faces like still water. Above them, holographic screens flickered with the last known footage of the armored figure. The way he had moved, the way he had struck, the way the xenomorphs had died at his feet, not in ones or twos, but in scores. The board watched in silence. Then one of them, a woman with silver hair and colder eyes, spoke the words that would doom more human lives than any decision in the corporation's long, bloody history. "We can use him." The others nodded. Of course they did. It was what they had been trained to do. Every horror in the galaxy was, to them, a resource waiting to be cataloged. Every miracle was a patent. Every nightmare was a product line. The armored figure was no different. If his armor could be replicated, entire armies could be equipped with it. If his weapons could be reverse-engineered, entire wars could be won. If his body could be studied, if his biology could be understood, then perhaps humanity could be reshaped in his image. Not for the good of humanity, of course. For the good of the shareholders. The order went out that same day. It was not called an assault. Corporations do not assault. They deploy. They contain. They recover. Elite security divisions were dispatched to the moon. Men in mad black armor with corporate insignia stitched over their hearts. They carried containment nets woven from monomolecular filament. They carried pulse rifles calibrated to disable without destroying. They carried tranquilizer rounds designed to sedate an elephant, a xenomorph queen, or, they were assured, anything else that walked on 2 legs. Their commander was a veteran named Colonel Vance, a man who had spent 30 years perfecting the art of pretending he did not have doubts. They landed in silence. They deployed in formations that would have impressed any general. They swept the ruined structures of the expedition with the practiced calm of professionals. And when they finally found him standing alone in the ruined mouth of the hive, framed by the corpses of a dozen Praetorians, they hesitated, not because they were afraid. They were too well trained to admit fear. They hesitated because for one long moment the reality of what they were looking at refused to fit inside their orders. He did not look at them. He did not raise a weapon. He did not speak. He turned slowly and continued into the tunnels. Vance told his men to follow. They did. They shouted command. They demanded compliance. They threatened in the way corporate soldiers threaten, with clipped legal phrasing and pre-approved warnings. The armored figure ignored them all. He was not being defiant. He was not being cruel. He simply did not consider them relevant. And that, more than anything else, was what infuriated the men who had been told they were the finest soldiers humanity had ever produced. Vance gave the order. The first pulse round struck the Slayer's back. They did not stagger him. The second volley struck his shoulder. He did not turn. The third volley, a full concentrated burst, hit him in the chest as he finally faced them, and the impact did not so much as tilt his stance. For a moment, Vance felt the small, cold weight of understanding drop into his stomach. He had made a mistake. Not a tactical mistake. Not a strategic mistake. A cosmic mistake. The kind of mistake ants make when they decide to sting the boot that is paused above them. Then the Slayer moved. What followed was not a battle. It was a lesson. He crossed the distance between them faster than trained eyes could follow. The first soldier's helmet cracked inward before he could scream. The second was lifted from the ground by his own rifle, which had been folded neatly around his throat. The third fired his tranquilizer rounds into the darkness where the figure had been, and the darkness answered by lifting him off his feet and folding him against a wall. Containment nets deployed. The Slayer walked through them as if they were mist. Sedatives were fired. They struck his armor and slid off like rain on stone. Vance shouted orders that no one lived long enough to obey. When it was over, Colonel Vance was the last man standing. He had dropped his rifle. He had raised his hands. He had done the only sensible thing left to do, which was nothing. The Slayer stood before him for a long moment. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. Vance sank to his knees. He wept, though he would never admit it to another living soul. And in that moment, the corporation lost something it did not yet know it had lost. It lost the illusion that it was in control. But the corporation was not finished. Because while the elite divisions had been dying in the tunnels, other operations had continued. Hidden laboratories, buried deep beneath the moon's surface in facilities that appeared on no official manifests, had been busy with older, darker work. The Slayer discovered one such lab by accident, or perhaps not by accident at all. A door hissed open in the wall of a service corridor, and he stepped inside without hesitation. What he found made even the hive seem clean. The lab was vast, bright, sterile in the way that only truly obscene places manage to be. Rows upon rows of tanks lined the walls, each one filled with pale green fluid, each one holding something that should not have existed. Xenomorph hybrids with engineer height and engineer eyes. Praetorians with skin that shimmered like oil. Queens smaller than the natural ones, but with additional limbs, additional jaws, additional mouths that opened and closed even in the fluid. Vats of black goo bubbled in the corners. Data screens flickered with the corporation's proud clinical language. Project designations, trial numbers, efficacy percentages, estimated yield. The corporate scientists had not been content with what nature and the engineers had given them. They had begun to build their own monsters. They had crossed xenomorph DNA with engineer flesh. They had grown queens in bottles. They had accelerated evolution in directions the universe had never intended. They believed they were creating weapons. They did not understand what they were actually doing. They were sharpening the knife that would one day be pressed against humanity's throat. The Slayer moved through the lab in silence. He did not shout. He did not smash the equipment in a rage. He simply began his work, systematic, precise. The tanks broke one by one. The abominations inside were put down before they could draw a first unnatural breath. The black goo burned in fires the corporation had not designed its walls to withstand. And by the time he left, the laboratory was a tomb, and the corporation had earned itself an enemy it could no longer afford. Every war leaves scars on the world it is fought upon. Some scars are visible. Burned forests, cities reduced to skeletal beams. Other scars go deeper, into the bones of the world itself, into the quiet places where memory and stone are the same thing. The battles between the Slayer, the Hive, and the Corporation were tearing scars of the second kind into the moon. And beneath those scars, something that had slept for a very long time was beginning to stir. The first signs were subtle. A tremor that did not match any seismic pattern the Corporation had on file. A hum that seemed to rise from the very rock, so low that human ears could barely catch it, yet loud enough that dogs, had there been any on the moon, would have refused to enter certain corridors. Then came the dreams. Every human survivor on the moon began to have them, whether they had slept beside a Slayer's trail or huddled in a corporate bunker. They dreamed of a door, an enormous door, older than stars, older than sound, and behind it something patient. Something that had been waiting so long it had almost forgotten what it was waiting for. Deep beneath the hive, past the tunnels the xenomorphs had carved, past the engineer chambers that had been sealed for millennia, past the layers of rock that no drill had ever touched, there was a gate. Not a gate built by any hand the Corporation would have recognized. Not engineer, not human, not xenomorph. It was older than any of them. Its surface was neither stone nor metal, but something in between, something that pulsed faintly with a light that had no color. Around its edges, symbols had been etched, not written, as if the universe itself had scratched a warning into its own skin. The engineers had known of the gate. Their records, hidden in murals and in tablets and in scattered data crystals, told the story in fragments. They had come to this moon long ago, not to seed it, not to claim it, but to bury something. Something they had encountered in the depths of another world. Something they could not kill, because it was not, in the way they understood the word, alive. They had built the gate to hold it. They had layered the moon with defenses. They had planted the seeds of the Black Goo, not as a gift to the universe, but as a leash. The xenomorphs, in all their monstrous perfection, had been designed to be the immune system of the prison. Every drone, every warrior, every queen, all of them at their deepest level existed to keep the thing behind the gate contained. But the engineers had made a mistake. They had underestimated their own creation. The xenomorphs had spread. They had adapted. They had escaped their assigned roles and become their own hunger. And in doing so, they had weakened the very prison they had been built to guard. Every hive that grew too large, every tunnel that dug too deep, every generation that mutated too far from its original design, each one had thinned the walls between this universe and whatever waited beyond. For centuries, the erosion had gone unnoticed. But now, with the Slayer tearing through the hive, with corporate soldiers dying in the tunnels, with laboratory abominations breeding in the dark, the last defenses were failing. The Slayer felt it before anyone else did. He was moving through a lower corridor when the sensation struck him. Not a sound, not a sight, a recognition. His helm turned, slowly, toward the deeper dark. The way a wolf turns when it catches a scent it has not smelled in a very long time. He knew this presence. He had fought it before, or something like it, in another life, in another universe. Not a demon, not a xenomorph, something older than both. Something that had been old when the first demon had first learned to scream. The kind of thing that did not belong to any hell he had walked, because it had helped design them. He descended. The tunnels grew stranger as he went. The xenomorph resin began to peel from the walls, as if the hive itself was retreating from what lay ahead. The air grew heavier, then lighter, then wrong in ways the human lung could not have survived. Gravity flickered. Time did strange things. He passed a corridor where a corporate soldier lay dead, and beside the soldier, a corporate soldier still alive, screaming silently at nothing. He passed a chamber where the walls wept a liquid that was not water, not blood, not oil, but something that carried memories of all three. He did not stop. He kept walking. At last he came to the gate. It rose before him, vast and patient, and even his ancient armor seemed to feel the weight of it. The symbols along its edges pulsed faintly, in a rhythm that matched no heartbeat known to biology. Cracks ran through its surface, thin and spreading. Something on the other side pressed against them, testing, tasting, waiting. The Slayer stood before the gate for a long moment. He did not draw a weapon. He did not raise a fist. He simply looked. And for the first time since his awakening, something in the tilt of his helm suggested a truth he had not shared with anyone. He had been sealed away for a reason, and that reason was standing on the other side of this door. The gate cracked further. A single fissure widened, and from it a light spilled that had no place in any spectrum. Reality bent around it. Stone flowed like water. Water hardened like bone. Sound became color, and color became memory, and memory became something that looked back. The Slayer took one step backward, not in fear, in calculation. He was not ready, not yet. Above, on the moon's surface, the world began to change. The violet light of the dead star flickered and dimmed. The mountains groaned. New shapes rose from the plains, structures that had not been there an hour before, structures that had never been built by any hand. Ancient runes bled up through the corporate outposts. Screens filled with static that spoke words and languages no living tongue remembered. The moon was no longer merely a moon. It was becoming a doorway, a wound, a nightmare-made geography. And in the corporate command center, the executives who had ordered the expedition sat frozen before their monitors. They did not speak. They did not move. They only watched, because for the first time in their long careers they understood, with a clarity that would haunt what remained of their lives, that they had not discovered a weapon. They had not uncovered a treasure. They had not stumbled upon a resource. They had opened a wound in the universe. And the universe was about to bleed. The gate broke on the third day, not with an explosion, not with a scream. It broke the way a dam breaks when the water has finally decided it will no longer be denied. There was a long, slow groan of stone that was not stone, a shudder that ran through the moon from core to crust, and then a silence so complete that every living creature on the moon, from the deepest drone to the highest executive in orbit, paused whatever it was doing and listened. Because silence in a place like this is never empty. Silence is the sound of something drawing breath before it speaks. The first wave was light, actual light, a red pulse that rolled up from the depths of the moon and burst through its surface in 100 places at once. Corporate outposts caught in the pulse simply ceased to be, not destroyed, not burned, unmade. Where a communications tower had stood, there was suddenly only a scorched circle of ash and a smell like burning oceans. Where a supply depot had crouched among the rocks, there was now a crater filled with a slow, patient smoke that whispered in voices no one wanted to translate. Then came the second wave, the hell wave. It flooded the tunnels first, because the tunnels were closest to the wound. It touched the Xenomorph hive with a hand that was not a hand, and the hive in all its ancient perfection began to change. Drones that had been the color of black glass now grew veins of molten red beneath their skin. Veins that pulsed with a heat that had never belonged to their biology. Their heads elongated further. Their tails ended in barbs that dripped fire instead of acid. They screamed, for the first time in their species' history, with voices that carried actual pain. Warriors sprouted horns from their curved skulls. Their claws grew longer, blacker, edged with a strange, flickering light. Praetorians towered even higher, their bone crowns melting and reforming into shapes that suggested crowns of a different kingdom. And the queens. The queens changed most of all. There was more than one queen in the hive. There had always been. But now, as the hell energy poured through them, they became something else. Their bodies swelled with a corruption that was not merely biological. Their eggs, still tucked in the resin of their chambers, began to hatch things that had never been in the original design. Facehuggers with faces, chest-bursters that emerged already speaking words no infant should know. And the queens themselves, once creatures of pure appetite, now looked out from their nests with something new in their many eyes. They had been possessed, not by demons in the human sense of the word, but by something that used the demonic as a lesser tongue. The hive was no longer a hive. It had become an infernal court, and the perfect organism had become a subject in it. On the surface, the corporate armies watched their screens in a stunned, choking silence. Sensors picked up energy signatures that had no place in any scientific database. Drones flew overhead and returned with footage that made the pilots vomit. The generals, safe in orbit, ordered new strategies. Bombardments, chemical weapons, nuclear warheads if necessary. Anything to reassert the illusion of control. But the corporation had built its empire on the assumption that everything, in the end, could be measured. What was crawling out of the moon could not be measured. It could only be witnessed. And witnesses on the moon that day did not last long. Between the hell and the hive stood the Slayer. He had descended once to test the door. Now he walked back up through the tunnels, methodically, patiently, cutting down every hellborn warrior that crossed his path. Where a normal xenomorph would have died to a shotgun blast, a hellborn drone required more. He gave it more. Where a normal Praetorian would have fallen to a chainsaw, an infernal Praetorian required flame. He carried flame. Where a possessed queen might have laid 1,000 more of her cursed eggs, he did not allow her to lay a single one. He crushed her nest. He silenced her voice. He moved on. Human survivors, still following the distant echoes of his weapons, watched him from hidden alcoves and broken vents. What they saw could not be described in the language of their childhood. It could barely be described in the language of nightmares. The armored figure moved through waves of hellborn xenomorphs the way a sculptor moves through marble. Each strike was deliberate. Each kill was final. He did not shout. He did not celebrate. He did not slow. And behind him, the ground was littered with the smoking remains of creatures that should have overwhelmed a battalion. The corporation, in a final act of desperation, deployed everything it had left. Orbital drop pods rained down onto the moon, carrying every experimental weapon the laboratories had ever produced. Synthetic soldiers with reinforced skeletons, prototype exosuits driven by mad pilots. Even the lab-grown xenomorph hybrids that had not yet been destroyed were released, in the vain hope that horror could be turned against horror. What resulted was not a battle. It was a collision of hell. Corporate hybrids tore through hellborn drones. Hellborn drones dragged corporate synthetics into the earth. Exosuits fired weapons that opened small, temporary tears in reality. And through it all, the Slayer walked, cutting a straight, patient line through the chaos, as if none of it were happening on a scale that mattered to him. Human survivors, trapped between 3 impossible forces, had nowhere to run. The corporation would kill them for having seen too much. The hive would kill them for existing. Hell would kill them because that was what hell did. And yet, some of them, watching the Slayer's back as he moved through the impossible, chose to follow anyway. Because dying near him felt different than dying alone. Because his silence was, in its own strange way, the only promise they had left. Mountains fell that day. Entire ranges collapsed under the weight of the energies unleashed. Ancient engineered temples rose from beneath the rock, awakened by the disturbance, their long-dormant defenses firing at anything that moved. Reality itself began to tear in small places. A soldier in an exosuit stepped through what he thought was a doorway and emerged in a place that was not the moon and was not anywhere. A hellborn Praetorian charged through a wall of reality and returned to something even the hell had not intended. And still, through the collapse, the corruption, the tearing of the world, one figure kept moving. Not faster, not slower, just forward. Because forward was the only direction the Slayer had ever known. And forward was the only direction that mattered. Because somewhere ahead the true horror was still waking, and it had a great deal to answer for. The infection did not stay on the moon. It could not. Hell has never respected borders, and the perfect organism had never respected walls. Within days, the first distress signals began to leak from nearby colonies. A mining outpost on a barren world called Argos 4 fell silent within hours. A terraforming station on Draco 6 broadcast a final message that consisted only of screams and one word, repeated over and over, in a voice that did not sound human. The word was fire. A frontier settlement on a green moon called Halcyon simply vanished from the maps, its beacon replaced by a low, patient hum that made every operator who heard it weep. The corporation could no longer pretend. It could no longer contain. It could no longer sell the illusion that the situation was recoverable. Colonial governments demanded answers. Independent fleets scrambled to defend their sectors. Panicked civilians rioted in the great orbital cities, breaking the mirrored windows of Weyland-Yutani offices, dragging executives into the streets in scenes the corporation's press releases would never manage to explain away. In some sectors, the corporation's private armies fired on the very colonists they had once been paid to protect. In others, they simply fled. The empire that had believed itself untouchable was fracturing in real time. Military fleets tried what militaries always try: orbital bombardments, fusion strikes, long-range missile barrages designed to sterilize entire continents. Some of the smaller outbreaks were contained this way, at the cost of everything and everyone within the blast radius. But the larger sites, the sites where hell had established true root, refused to burn. Missiles vanished into red mist above their targets. Bombs detonated in air, harming nothing but the pilots who had flown them in. Fleet admirals who ordered nuclear strikes on infected colonies watched, in the safety of their command decks, as the strikes were simply undone, as the fire folded backward into itself and the colony below remained unchanged, waiting. Humanity, for the first time in a very long time, faced the possibility of its own end. At the edge of the affected region, one colony refused to fall. Its name was Alathia. It was not the largest colony in human space, nor the wealthiest, nor the most heavily defended. It was a mid-sized world with a temperate climate, a modest population, and a governor who had, for reasons no one could quite explain, ordered every ship, every soldier, every civilian to remain when the evacuation orders came. He was a quiet man named Amadeo Reyes, and when his advisors asked him why, he said only, "We have run enough. If humanity dies today, it will not die running." Alathia's population braced for the end. And then, on the evening of the third day, a single ship descended from orbit onto its main landing field. It was a battered corporate shuttle, its hull scored with damage no repair yard would have accepted. Its engines coughed as they cycled down. Its cargo bay hissed open, and from within, alone, walked an armored figure whose reputation had reached even this remote world through whispered rumor. The Slayer stepped onto Alathia's soil in the fading light. The soldiers waiting there did not fire. They had been ordered not to. Governor Reyes had said, in his announcement to the defense forces, that if a stranger came from the darkness in armor the color of old wars, they were not to raise a weapon against him. They were to let him pass. They were to follow if he permitted it, and they were to fight beside him if he made room. The Slayer walked past the soldiers. He did not acknowledge them. He did not have to. Behind him, without a word being spoken, they fell into formation, not because they had been ordered to, because they wanted to. Because for the first time in their careers, they felt they were part of something that might, against all mathematics, matter. The battle for Alathia began at dawn. Hellborn xenomorphs came in numbers that darkened the sky. Infernal Praetorians led the charge, taller now than any building in the colony's outer districts. Possessed queens moved among the rear ranks, laying eggs in the very air, which burst and hatched and dropped their monstrous children onto the streets. Above them all, small tears in reality opened and closed, disgorging things that had no name in any language humanity had invented. It should have been the end. By every conventional measure, it was the end. But something happened on Alathia that had not happened anywhere else. Humanity did not break. Engineers who had spent their lives repairing air conditioners found themselves rewiring pulse cannons into makeshift defense turrets. Marines who had lost every squad they had ever served with found themselves leading civilian militias into positions they had drawn up in the dust. Pilots who had never flown in combat found themselves strapping into gunships and taking off, not because they thought they would survive, but because there were still people beneath them who might. Scientists who had once worked for the corporation, who had helped design the very abominations now marching on the walls, worked through the night to invent new counters, new weapons, new hopes. Old men with rifles they had not fired in decades stood on rooftops beside teenagers who had only ever held a rifle in a video game. And in the streets, mothers pressed their children into shelters and then picked up whatever was heavy and returned to the fight. The Slayer moved through the battle like a rumor made real. Wherever the line was about to break, he was there. Wherever a Praetorian towered over a screaming crowd, he was there. Wherever a queen laid her cursed eggs into a schoolyard, he was there. He did not save every life. He could not. But he saved enough of them that, for the first time since the wound in the universe had opened, the tide slowed. He did something else too. He fought beside the humans. Not for them. Beside them. When a young sergeant made a stand at a broken bridge with the last 12 members of her platoon, the Slayer appeared at her flank and held the western approach while she held the east. She never spoke to him. He never spoke to her. But when the assault ended and only 3 of her platoon remained, he turned toward her once, briefly, and inclined his helmed head. It was the closest thing to acknowledgement he had ever given anyone in this universe. She wept without knowing why. By the time the sun rose over Alathia the next day, the colony still stood, burning in places, bleeding everywhere, but standing. And in every settlement that still had a working transmitter, the story spread. Alathia had not fallen. Humanity had held, and an armored stranger had fought beside them, silent and terrible, and refused to let them die alone. Hope, that oldest of human weapons, began to sharpen itself again. Every myth ends where it began. Every long walk returns to the door it once passed through. The Slayer knew this. The universe knew this. And in the smoking aftermath of Alathia's defense, both of them turned their attention back to the moon where all of this had started, because the thing behind the gate was almost fully awake, and the time for delaying it had run out. He returned alone. The soldiers of Alathia had wanted to follow. Governor Reyes had wanted to send an army. The Slayer permitted none of it. This was not a fight that armies could win. This was a fight that had always belonged to him, from the moment he had been sealed in that ancient sarcophagus. From the moment his existence had first been catalogued in engineer murals, from a time before there had been any word for time. He boarded his battered shuttle. He set his course. And Alathia watched him leave the way children watch a father go off to a war they know he might not return from. The moon he came back to was no longer a moon. It had become a wound in the shape of a world. Its surface was blistered with new geographies, mountains that had not been there a week before, oceans that had risen from beneath the crust and boiled in the wrong colors. Its atmosphere pulsed with light that was not light. Whole regions of it existed in more than one place at once, so that a single valley might contain a burning temple, a xenomorph nest, and a corporate laboratory all layered upon each other. None of them fully real, all of them fully dangerous. At the center of it all, at the mouth of the ancient gate, the primordial entity had finally begun to manifest. It did not have a shape at first. It was not the kind of creature that needed one. It expressed itself through the world around it, through mountains that bent to look at intruders, through skies that hummed with hostile intent, through the corpses of hellborn xenomorphs that rose again with new eyes and new purposes. It spoke in earthquakes. It laughed in cosmic wind. And when at last it chose to appear in a form the human mind could hold even briefly, it did so with a kind of contempt, as if putting on a body were beneath its dignity. The form it chose was enormous, not merely tall, titanic, cathedral proportions layered with details that hurt to look at, faces on faces, wings that were not wings, eyes that opened wherever attention landed. It stood in the ruined valley before the gate, and every survivor in orbit who saw its image on a screen turned their faces away, because looking at it too long unraveled something in the mind that could not be reknit. Only the Slayer looked at it directly. It spoke to him, not in word, in understanding. It told him in a single silent moment that lasted as long as a human life, the truth the engineers had spent their species trying to hide. It had been born before the first star. It had walked between universes when universes had been young. It had watched the engineers rise, and it had, in a bored moment, chosen to consume their favorite worlds. They had fought it. They had failed. They had learned in their failure that some horrors cannot be killed with conventional weapons. So they had begun to build. They had built the xenomorphs, not as their greatest creation, but as a desperate leash. They had built the Black Goo, not as a gift, but as a chain. They had built 100 other species, most of them long extinct, all of them failed attempts to make a weapon terrible enough to stand against the thing behind the gate. Every failure had been a step in a longer stairway. Every extinction had been a page in a book. The engineers had died at last, not because they were weak, but because they were still bound by the natural rules of a natural universe. Their weapons had all been shaped ultimately by biology, by ambition, by the same architecture that could be corrupted, twisted, turned against them. They had made monsters, and every monster had eventually become another instrument of the very darkness they had tried to hold back. Only one thing had never been part of their plan: the Slayer. He had not been designed by them. He had not been shaped by their goo, nor grown in their tanks, nor calibrated in their laboratories. He belonged to no evolution they could trace. He was, in the truest sense, an intrusion. Something that had wandered in from another universe entirely, drawn by hell as a moth is drawn to a flame, and had walked through hell so many times that hell itself had begun to fear the sound of his boots. The engineers had, at some point in their long war, encountered him. And in their final, desperate act, they had sealed him here, on this moon before this gate, not as a prisoner, but as a final defense. A rifle set beside the door. A promise left in stone. If we fail, they had written in murals, no, I had read for eons, he will remain. Let the darkness meet him first. The primordial entity understood this, and in its understanding it laughed, not with sound, with the whole of the moon, because from its perspective, the Slayer was still just another weapon, another attempt, another failure waiting to happen. It had swallowed gods before. It had eaten dimensions. What could one armored figure possibly do to it, no matter how loud his gun, no matter how long his patience? It found out. The battle that followed cannot be described in the language of any single war. It was fought on the moon and above the moon and beneath the moon and inside pockets of reality that folded out of the moon like the petals of a black flower. It was fought against the possessed queens, and the Slayer put them down one by one, each death a hymn. It was fought against the infernal hive, and he burned it root and branch until the last hellborn drone lay still. It was fought against corporate superweapons launched in a final panic from orbit, and he tore them from the sky with weapons the corporation had not known his armor contained. And at last, when every other enemy had fallen, when the mountains had shattered and the sky had bled and the very air had grown so thin with unraveling reality that stars had begun to disappear behind storms that had no place in physics, it was fought against the entity itself. There was no dialogue. There was no monologue. There was only impact. The Slayer struck first. He struck the entity where it did not expect to be struck, in the joint between one of its shapes and another, in the seam of an idea it had thought was invincible. The entity retaliated with a blow that leveled a mountain range. He absorbed it. He moved. He struck again, and again, and again. Each blow reduced the entity's grip on the moon by a fraction of a percent. Each blow forced it to spend a little more of the ancient power it had assumed was infinite. Each blow taught it, one lesson at a time, that infinity was a word, and words could be broken. The final blow came at the gate itself. The Slayer drove the entity backward step by monstrous step, until its cathedral bulk was framed once more by the doorway from which it had emerged. And then, with a strength he had earned across universes, he struck it a final time and drove it back through. The gate slammed shut. The seals were formed. The moon convulsed and grew still. And a silence, older than any of them, settled at last over the wound in the world. Silence returned to the galaxy the way a tide returns to an empty beach. Gently, steadily, as if nothing terrible had ever happened here. The hell portals, one by one, sealed themselves. The tears in reality knitted shut. The unnatural mountains sank back into the crust of the moon, taking their impossible geometries with them. And the wound at the gate closed and the seals held. And the thing behind them turned back toward whatever eternity it had known before it had made the mistake of assuming this universe would be easy. The remaining xenomorphs, no longer possessed, no longer part of a corrupted hive, became scattered and feral. Small clusters of them survived in the deep places of certain worlds, dangerous but manageable, dangerous in the ways they had always been, without the added weight of hell riding on their backs. Colonial Marines learned once again how to hunt them. Corporations, quieter now, learned once again how to fear them. And the story of what had almost happened, of what had nearly opened, began slowly to be forgotten in the way that all near ends are forgotten by species that would rather not remember them. Weyland-Yutani did not survive intact. When the evidence of its laboratories reached the public record, when the recordings of Colonel Vance's last mission were leaked from an anonymous source, when the atrocities of its hybrid programs were catalogued in hearings that ran for years, the corporation broke, not into nothing. Corporations rarely die, but it broke into pieces, into subsidiaries, into smaller shadows, and the great mirrored towers where the board had once sat around their table of black glass were sold off, floor by floor, to buyers who did not want to know their history. Humanity, battered and bloody, began the long work of rebuilding. Alathia became a symbol. Its defense was taught in academies. Governor Reyes, though he never sought office again, was remembered as the man who had said, "We have run enough," and made the words mean something. The soldiers who had fought at his side became teachers or drunks or both. The children they had saved grew up and had children of their own and told them, in the voices adults reserve for the stories that matter most, that once, when the sky had been full of things that should not exist, a stranger had come and stayed just long enough and gone, because he did go. Of course he did. No one knew where. No one knew when. He was seen at the edges of colonies for a few weeks after Alathia. He was seen on a ship that had no manifest, boarding vessels that were not scheduled to depart. And then he was not seen at all. He left no address. He left no promise. He left only a shape in memory, an armored silhouette against a red horizon, and the small, patient certainty that if the darkness ever returned, it would not return unanswered. Survivors in the quiet years that followed preserved what they could of him. Security recordings from 100 outposts. A few melted pieces of armor collected from battlefields. Eyewitness testimonies transcribed into simple books that were passed hand to hand among the colonies, more like scripture than history. Generations later, the stories have become common. In every quiet tavern on every remote world, there was a version. When the monsters come, they said, an armored man follows. He does not ask your name. He does not learn your language. He simply arrives and he simply ends what has begun, and then he simply goes. The final scene of his known life was a small one. On an abandoned colony at the far edge of explored space, a signal began to broadcast from a ruined outpost. A distress call. Old code. A pattern that no living transmitter should have been able to send. Somewhere in the darkness between stars, a small ship altered course. Its hull was scored with damage no repair yard would have accepted. Its engines hummed, low and patient, as though they knew the way without being told. It docked at the outpost without ceremony. Its cargo bay hissed open, and from within alone walked a figure whose reputation had long since outgrown any single universe. He did not hesitate. He did not speak. He stepped onto the abandoned dock, checked his weapons, and turned toward the darkness where the signal had originated. Somewhere in that darkness, something new believed it had found a universe of its own to devour. Somewhere in that darkness, something old believed the myth was only a myth. Where evil believes it has found a new universe, it never expects him to arrive first.